Hello, welcome to the first episode of Tales from the Hedge. Now, today we are going to be looking at a story that is very close to my own heart as it is from Newcastle, where I was born and where I come from. And we are looking at the Newcastle witch trials. Now, just before we jump into that story, I'd just like to give a quick shout out to Amazon. Not a lot of people know that Amazon offers a subscription that allows you to borrow thousands of Kindle and audiobooks, up to 10 at a time, with no limit on how many you check out or return, and it's all available for under $10 a month. So if that is something that you are interested in, check out unlimited.lilyoak.net, and that will take you to that offer and allow you to sign up. When you think about large witch trials in the UK, the two that spring to mind are Pendle and Berwick. However, 17th century Tyneside also played host to one of the biggest European witchcraft trials in history. The mid 17th century was not a happy place for everyday citizens of Newcastle Upon-Tyne. In the 1630s, the plague had swept through the town, wiping out over a quarter of the population. Through the 1640s, the Civil War saw the town captured by the Scots, not once, but twice, once in 1640 and then again in 1644. By the time the Civil War had ended, in the late 1640s, Newcastle was in the hands of the Puritans. Now, the Puritan Corporation not only fully exploited the massive coal trade of Newcastle, but were also hugely oppressive when it came to the people and the citizens of Newcastle. Fear of witchcraft was nationally very high throughout the 16th and 17th century. In Newcastle, this countrywide fear was further compounded by the fundamentally Christian Puritans running the town. Having previously heard a petition concerning witchcraft earlier in the year, in December of 1649, the Puritan Council welcomed a witch pricker into the town to root out anyone guilty of such practices. Now, witch prickers or witch hunters, there's a few different names for them. These were kind of independent people who would travel from city to city or town to town, and they would be paid to sort of go out there and make accusations, and well, not so much make accusations, but they would encourage other people to make accusations and, root out these often women, but there were men convicted as well, on behalf of local authorities. So it was a fairly common practice, and there are one or two. Obviously, Matthew Hopkins is fairly well mentioned throughout history, but there's a lot of them, including this one in the Newcastle witch trials, that actually we don't know much about. We don't even have a name for this person who had such a huge influence on this part of Newcastle's history. Now, the Puritan Council sent out messages to let everyone know that if they suspect someone of being a witch, they should make their accusations known. In such a miserable climate, frustrations and long-held feuds led to 30 people being brought before the magistrate. And don't forget, this is an accusation that you could make for, you can pull it out of thin air. You can accuse anyone of being a witch, if you had some bad luck, if your life just wasn't going very well, it was quite easy to go, oh, well, it must be a witch, rather than taking any sort of personal responsibility for it. So when we're looking at periods of history where, as we've established already, things were very difficult for people and they just generally felt as if, life wasn't fair, to be able to go, oh, well, it's this person's fault or that person's fault, was something that could be very appealing to people. And it also meant that there was a huge ability for people to air out personal grievances if you just didn't like someone, or someone was, making your life difficult, or just generally someone you didn't like. Accusing them of witchcraft was a very simple solution for getting rid of them. So we often see in witch trials huge numbers of people brought forward. And given that we had this Puritan council, given all the hardships Newcastle had gone through economically, it really was a perfect storm to have this invitation put out there for people to just lay these accusations. Now, torture may not have been legal at this time. However, although the methods used by the witch pricker may not have been technically classified as torture, in reality, that is exactly what they were. They were deprived of sleep, made to walk for hours on end, and publicly humiliated during the various tests the witch pricker put them through. These included being stripped naked in public, to look for witches' marks, which, in all honesty, could be anything from a birthmark to a slightly large mole. There's hundreds of documentation in court cases and just anecdotal evidence of these being literally like pimples. They could be anything that wasn't perfect skin and was a slight blemish could be put down as being one of these witches' marks. The women would also have their skirts lifted above their heads to be pricked by a bodkin, which is basically like a big needle, to see if they would bleed. Basically, the thought was that if a woman didn't bleed, it was because she was enchanted to not be able to be harmed. It was seen as an unnatural thing not to bleed if you were pricked. So this was quite a commonly held test, basically. It's worth mentioning at this point that the witch pricker was paid on the number of people found guilty. He would receive 30 shillings for each witch he successfully found, and at a time when the average daily wage was less than 3 pence, finding people guilty was very, very lucrative. It will come as little surprise to the cynical among you that he went on to find 27 of the 30 accused guilty. And this will sound insane to a lot of people, but it was the norm back then that this person, again, who we don't even have a name for, could just rock up into a town and be like, guilty, guilty, yeah, I'm just going to start pricking these women with pins, didn't bleed, guilty. And this, this was a horrific crime to be found guilty of. The fact that this amount of power was put into the hands of these people. And this is when we had secular courts. We're not talking about religious courts anymore. By the time this happened, courts and church were meant to be seen as separate entities. So to still have this level of just absolute sort of power being handed off to people just is terrifying. But it is what it is. Now, although the magistrates didn't seem to find this high number suspicious, Several local prominent people did and spoke up for some of the accused. The most noted example of this is Lieutenant Colonel Hobson. Now, when a particularly young and attractive woman was brought to be tested, her skirts were lifted and she was pricked with the bodkin, and the witch pricker declared she did not bleed. She was also asked if she felt the prick, and when she said she felt nothing, the witch pricker declared this was further proof of her guilt. However, Hobson, an ex-military surgeon, and some would speculate a Baptist, getting somewhat fed up of the Puritans in Newcastle at the time, suspected sleight of hand and deception. Initially, Hobson tried to use the witch pricker's own reasoning of physical appearance and witches' marks against him, stating the young woman did not appear to look like a witch and therefore shouldn't be subject to the test. When the witch pricker dismissed his reasoning, Hobson demanded the test was done again, in closer, clearer view. The test was repeated, and this time the young woman clearly bled and was released. Often these bodkins that were used to test women were said to have been retractable, meaning that it was almost like a sleight of hand stage trick, so that when the needle was pressed against them, it actually retracted and went up into the handle of the device rather than actually staying fixed. So it appears on closer inspection, the test was repeated and the young woman was released, thankfully, in this case. But what is truly concerning is that even after Hobson proved that the witch pricker's tactics were at best inefficient and at worst deceptive, they allowed a lot of the other guilty verdicts to stand, which again, you can't really, if you apply modern standards to it, you can't really comprehend this. They had proven that this test he was using to declare people's guilt was, as I say, at best faulted. At best, we could say it didn't work. At worst, he was doing it on purpose, because don't forget, he was getting 30 shillings for each of these people, and that is a lot of money back then. So, you've got this situation where it's proven that these things, that this is completely ineffective. This is not a good way to establish guilt. And yet still, everyone's like, oh yeah, but all those other times, I'm sure it totally worked fine. All of those other times, that's definitely okay. So we had that situation as well. Now, between the efforts of Hobson and a few others, the number of those condemned fell to 17 women and 1 man. Gallows were constructed on the town moor, and on the 21st of August 1650 they were hanged, along with 9 sheep rustlers. That's a huge number of people to lose their lives on what is essentially the say-so of 1 man. Now, this is something we see repeated throughout this time period and throughout the witch trials. But it's just, when you go through Newcastle, where the gallows were constructed on the town moor, it's now, it's this beautiful open kind of parkland right next to the city centre. There's fun fairs on it, the town moor's on it every year. And when you think about that, it was essentially used to murder, if you like, these people who there really isn't any evidence at all did anything wrong. It's so jarring, and it goes beyond belief. Now, this is not the last, them being hung for a lot of cases. In a lot of witch trials, the accused or the guilty, which they were found at the time, being hung is kind of the end of the story, if you like. However, this is not the last we hear of the Newcastle witches, because in January 2008, St Andrew's Church in Newgate Street, Newcastle, was having some building work done. And a lot of the work was kind of external work, so it was being done in and around the churchyard, and a lot of it was to add some new lighting. After a period of rain, fragments of bone and skull were found in a ditch, and it is believed to have been the unmarked pit that the bodies of those hanged were thrown in. Now, this is something that's happened a few times in witch trials, because people accused of witchcraft and found guilty weren't allowed to be buried. Actually, it's unusual they were in a churchyard at all. It's thought that the part of the churchyard they were found in might not have originally been part of it, and it was actually unconsecrated ground at the time. It's one of those situations where obviously if you're found guilty of witchcraft, you're seen to be in league with, Satan or evil forces. So to have a Christian burial is not something that would have been allowed to have happened. Now, this is also the point where the story gets a little bit darker in modern day context, because up until this point, like me, you likely thought all of the accused were innocent and there was nothing actually paranormal associated with this case in any way, shape or form. However, although the City Council were quick to try and play down the bones, Newcastle Chronicle spoke to the caretaker of the church, a Mr. Bill Atkinson. Mr. Atkinson said that one of the men working there picked up a piece of one of the skulls and was showing it round to everybody. Obviously they just found this unmarked grave and there's all this folklore attached to it. So this guy who was working there was kind of like, oh my God, look what I found. Look, it's a skull, kind of showing it to people, wondering what you should do. And the next day, that man had broken out in sort of open sores all the way up his arm, and his doctor could not identify what the cause was. So he went from being fine to being covered in completely unexplainable sores and open wounds, and doctors could not find a cause. Now, that's a little bit we're not talking about something that was said in the way back when this case was tried. We're talking about 2008. We're talking about modern doctors and a story with named witnesses that was documented in the local press. So yeah, at that point you kind of have to wonder, maybe there was something in it. Maybe one or two of the people accused did try their hand at magic, and maybe hanging them for it and then disturbing their unmarked grave was not such a good idea. And the other thing we have to consider as part of this story is the true villain, or who I like to consider the true villain of this story, the witch pricker himself. Now, after he left Newcastle with all of his ill-gotten money from killing people, he's said to have headed north into Northumberland to try women in the rural parts of the northeast. However, it is kind of documented. It's anecdotal. We don't have any solid proof, but it's anecdotal that his reign of misery was brought to an end when he was arrested by Henry Ogle. The Ogles are quite a prominent family in Northumberland history. I won't go into it too much in this podcast, but there is a lot of sort of Northumbrian folklore and genuine history, but also folklore myth, that involves the Ogle family. But so despite, it looks like he was arrested by Henry Ogle and he escaped, fleeing to Scotland, where he was apprehended and held accountable for his actions. Now again, this is speculation, and it's really nice for us to think that this could be a true story, that after, doing what he did to these poor women and one man, that he would get his comeuppance. However, the issue we have with this is that the story says he was apprehended, if you like, in Scotland. Now, unlike England or parts of England at this time, Scotland does have really good court records. And if you dig into it, can't really find anything that documents someone being arrested and tried for this crime at the time. However, the anecdotal evidence we have goes on to say that he was sentenced to death. When he stood on the gallows, he admitted to causing the death of over 220 women in England and Scotland for 20 shillings apiece. Now, again, we can't be sure that that actually happened and he actually got his comeuppance, but I like to think he did. It may not be accurate. It may be hearsay and not based on written evidence, but there's a little part of me that likes to believe he did get his comeuppance for all the things he does. But I don't know. What do you think? Do you think he actually got what he deserved in the end? And what do you think about the workmen who burst out in sores from disturbing the grave in the churchyard? Can you think of an explanation for that one? Because I can't and a doctor can't. So who knows what really happened there? Anyway, that's where we're going to leave things for this month. This week, we may do more of these. We're going to do them fairly regularly. But let me know what you'd like me to talk about in these Tales from the Hedge. Is there a story you'd like to see me look at? Let me know in the comments below. If you're listening to this on YouTube and you'd like to download it as an MP3, you can do that by going over to our Patreon. One of our Patreon perks is the ability to download the Tales from the Hedge podcasts as MP3 downloads. So thank you to everyone Thank you to everyone who supports me over on Patreon, and I will be back very, very soon. Bye.